Arthur, this might feel sudden, but we are aggressively optimizing cash flow. The board has mandated a lean model. Therefore, your position has been deemed financially redundant.
Human Resources has already processed your severance. Security has a cardboard box for your personal items. You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate.
Please, my wife's cancer treatments. You can't do this.
The air inside the sprawling, glass-walled executive office at the top of the Vanguard Heavy Industries Tower was climate-controlled to a perfect, sterile 68 degrees. But to Arthur Pendleton, the room suddenly felt like a freezing vacuum, sucking the very oxygen from his lungs. Sitting behind a massive slab of imported Italian marble was Julian Vance. Julian was 32 years old, armed with a ruthless Ivy League MBA and a moral compass dictated entirely by profit margins. He wore a pristine $5,000 tailored suit, a platinum chronograph watch, and an expression of profound, chilling apathy. He did not look at Arthur as a human being. To Julian, the man standing on the other side of the desk was nothing more than a red line on a quarterly spreadsheet, a legacy liability that needed to be erased to secure a massive year-end executive bonus. The contrast between the two men was a devastating portrait of modern corporate America. Arthur Pendleton was 62 years old. He stood awkwardly in the pristine office wearing heavy, dark blue canvas coveralls. His broad shoulders were permanently stooped from decades of crawling under massive industrial turbines. His hands were thick and heavily calloused, the grease and motor oil permanently tattooed into the deep creases of his knuckles. He had given his youth, his health, and his absolute loyalty to this company. "Mr. Vance," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He gripped the edge of the marble desk to stop his hands from shaking. I don't understand. Financially redundant. I am the only mechanic on the floor who knows how to calibrate the old Mark IV presses. But more importantly, sir, I have been with Vanguard for 29 years and 360 days. Julian let out a soft, patronizing sigh, picking up a gold-plated pen and casually spinning it between his perfectly manicured fingers. He didn't say a word. "My full pension," Arthur continued, panic beginning to bleed into his voice. "The Tier 1 Legacy Retirement Package. It fully vests at 30 years. That is next Tuesday. You are firing me exactly 5 days before I earn my pension." A micro-smile, a fleeting cold twitch of satisfaction, flashed across Julian's face. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated, bloodless strategy. "The restructuring timeline is algorithmically determined, Arthur," Julian replied smoothly, entirely devoid of shame. "By liquidating top-heavy legacy contracts right before they hit maturation, the corporation is saving a projected $1.4 million in long-term payout liabilities over the next decade. It is a perfectly legal loophole. My fiduciary duty is to the shareholders, not to the mechanics. It's nothing personal, it is strictly business." The words hit Arthur with the kinetic force of a freight train. Strictly business. "My wife Martha," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking, entirely stripping away his pride. "She has stage 3 breast cancer, Mr. Vance. The Tier 1 pension. It includes lifetime premium healthcare coverage. If you terminate me today, I lose 80% of my retirement fund, and I lose her medical insurance. We will lose our home. We won't be able to afford her chemotherapy." Arthur, a man who had survived molten steel burns and crushed ribs on the factory floor without shedding a single tear, felt his eyes burn. "Please," Arthur begged, the desperation clawing at his throat. "I will take a pay cut. I will step down to a junior role. Let me just work the next 5 days for free. Just let me cross the 30-year mark. Please, I am begging you, it's for my wife." Julian stopped spinning the gold pen. He looked at the old, broken mechanic with a gaze so entirely devoid of empathy it was terrifying. "Vanguard Heavy Industries is not a charity, Arthur," Julian stated coldly. He reached across his desk and pressed a silver intercom button. "Security to the CEO's office. We have a terminated employee who is refusing to leave." Julian looked back at Arthur, his face a mask of absolute corporate indifference. "You had a good run. Your severance package includes 2 weeks of base pay. I suggest you look into state-funded medical programs for your wife. Now, get out of my office." 10 minutes later, Arthur Pendleton was escorted out of the building. He didn't get to say goodbye to the men he had mentored. He didn't get a retirement party or a gold watch. He was marched through the massive, roaring factory floor, the floor he had helped build, the machines he had kept alive with his own blood and sweat, flanked by 2 massive security guards like a common thief. In his calloused hands, he carried a small, flimsy cardboard box. Inside was a framed, fading photograph of Martha, a vintage steel wrench his father had given him, and a chipped coffee mug. That was the sum total of nearly 30 years of unbroken loyalty. The heavy, automated glass doors of the Vanguard Heavy Industries lobby slid shut behind him with a final, sealing click. Arthur stood alone on the wet, rain-slicked concrete sidewalk. The sky above the city was a bleak, suffocating gray, matching the crushing despair settling into his bones. He looked up at the towering, glittering glass skyscraper. The corporation had chewed him up, extracted every ounce of value from his physical body, and spat him out onto the street the moment it became profitable to do so. He had 29 years and 360 days of loyalty. He was short by 5 days. And because of the cruel, bottomless greed of one arrogant young executive, Arthur had absolutely no idea how he was going to keep his dying wife alive. Hello friends, and welcome back to our channel. Before we dive into the dark, desperate streets of tonight's story, please take a quick second to smash that like button, share this video, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Also, let us know in the comments, have you ever experienced a company betraying your loyalty? We read every single comment. Now, let us return to a man who has been pushed to the absolute brink of ruin. 2 weeks had passed since the heavy glass doors of Vanguard Heavy Industries had locked Arthur Pendleton out of his own life. The reality of his termination had hit with devastating, immediate force. The severance check barely covered the mortgage. The state-funded health insurance portal was a bureaucratic labyrinth of waitlists and denials. And Martha's medical bills were piling up on the kitchen counter like a mountain of impending doom. Arthur had no pension. He had no savings. At 62 years old, his body was breaking down, and nobody wanted to hire a senior floor mechanic when they could exploit a 20-year-old for half the price. Desperation breeds a terrifying kind of endurance. To keep the lights on, to keep the aggressive debt collectors at bay, Arthur had turned to the gig economy. He signed up to drive for Uber. It was a humiliating, grueling existence for a master mechanic. A man who used to calibrate million-dollar industrial turbines with absolute precision was now ferrying drunk college students and impatient businessmen across the city for pennies on the mile. It was 2:15 a.m. on a freezing, torrential Tuesday night. The rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets, turning the neon-lit streets of the city into blurry streaks of red and yellow. Arthur sat behind the wheel of his old, meticulously maintained sedan. His eyes burned with exhaustion, rimmed with dark, heavy bags. His back ached with a dull, constant throb. He had been driving for 14 straight hours. He desperately needed to go home to check on Martha to sleep. But the Uber app on his dashboard showed he was $30 short of his daily goal, the exact amount he needed to buy his wife's anti-nausea medication for the week. Just one more ride, Arthur told himself, rubbing his calloused hands over his tired face. Just one more. The screen on his dashboard suddenly illuminated with a loud ping. The pickup location was deep in the exclusive, heavily wooded northern hills of the city, a neighborhood of sprawling, gated estates that Arthur rarely ventured into. The destination was the international airport. It was a long fare. It would easily cover the medication. Without hesitating, Arthur accepted the ride and turned his sedan toward the winding, dark mountain roads. 20 minutes later, Arthur pulled up to massive, wrought-iron security gates. The gates silently swung open, revealing a long, winding driveway that ended at a sprawling architectural masterpiece of a home, constructed of dark stone and sheer glass. Standing beneath the illuminated portico, shielded from the torrential downpour, was an elderly man. He appeared to be in his late 70s or early 80s. Despite the late hour, the man was impeccably dressed in a tailored, heavy wool overcoat, clutching a worn leather briefcase. But he didn't look like the typical arrogant executives Arthur usually picked up. There was a quiet, profound weariness in his posture, and a sharp, calculating intelligence in his pale blue eyes. Arthur quickly put the car in park and stepped out into the freezing rain, popping his umbrella open to shield the passenger as he loaded the leather briefcase into the trunk. "Terrible night for a flight, sir," Arthur offered politely, opening the rear door. The elderly man offered a faint, strained smile. "Business does not wait for the weather, my friend. Thank you for making the drive up here." The man climbed into the back seat. The Uber app identified the passenger simply as William. Arthur got back behind the wheel, his clothes damp from the rain, and started the long descent back down the winding, pitch-black mountain road toward the highway. The heater hummed softly, fighting the chill in the cabin. For the first 10 minutes the ride was silent. Arthur kept his eyes glued to the slippery, treacherous asphalt, his heavy hands gripping the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror he could see William staring out the rain-streaked window, occasionally rubbing his chest with a slow, methodical motion. "You work late hours," William suddenly observed, his voice surprisingly strong, cutting through the silence of the car. "Or rather, early mornings. It is a hard shift to pull at our age." Arthur offered a dry, humorless chuckle. "Needs must, sir. When the medical bills start knocking, you answer the door, no matter what time it is." William's expression softened slightly, a flicker of deep empathy crossing his weathered face. "I am sorry to hear that. I know the burden of medical debt well. My late wife spent her final years in and out of hospitals. The system is entirely broken." Arthur nodded slowly, keeping his eyes on the road. "It is. But the system is built by men who only care about the bottom line. You can give them 30 years of your blood and they'll still cut your throat for a decimal point." William frowned, leaning slightly forward in his seat. 30 years. You don't look like a career driver. You have the hands of a craftsman, an engineer perhaps." "Mechanic," Arthur corrected, a brief flash of pride returning to his voice. "Heavy industry. Industrial turbines, high-pressure presses. I kept the iron beating for 29 years and 360 days. William's eyes suddenly sharpened, a sudden intensity replacing his polite curiosity. 29 years. You were terminated right before your pension vested." 5 days short, Arthur said, the bitterness rising in his throat like bile. "Some Ivy League kid with a spreadsheet decided my wife's cancer treatments were a legacy liability, so they threw me out." William opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. Instead, a sharp, ragged gasp tore from the elderly man's throat. Arthur's eyes shot to the rearview mirror. William was suddenly clutching his chest with both hands, his knuckles turning stark white. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him a terrifying shade of ashen gray. His heavy wool coat heaved as he fought desperately for air. The briefcase slid off the leather seat, crashing onto the floorboard as the man slumped violently to the side. "Sir." Arthur called out, his heart instantly hammering against his ribs. "William, are you all right?" "Left arm," William wheezed, his eyes rolling back slightly, his voice a barely audible, agonizing whisper. "Crushing." Arthur didn't need a medical degree to know exactly what was happening. It was a massive, sudden myocardial infarction, a widowmaker heart attack, and they were currently 5 miles down a winding, isolated mountain road in the middle of a torrential storm, at least 20 minutes away from the nearest hospital. The Uber app on his phone blinked, a sterile blue line directing him toward the airport. If he pulled over and waited for an ambulance in this weather, the old man in the back seat would be dead before the paramedics even crossed the city limits. Arthur gripped the steering wheel. He was exhausted. He was broken. But he was not a man who let things die on his watch. With a sudden, violent twist of his calloused hands, Arthur jerked the steering wheel to the left, sending the sedan skidding across the wet asphalt, completely abandoning the route to the airport. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, pushing the old engine to its absolute limit, plunging into the dark, rain-soaked night. The tires of the old sedan screamed against the slick, rain-soaked asphalt as Arthur Pendleton threw the car into a sharp, terrifying drift, completely abandoning the calculated GPS route to the airport. The vehicle fishtailed dangerously for a split second before Arthur's heavy, calloused hands wrestled the steering wheel back into absolute control, his muscle memory and mechanical instincts taking over entirely. "Hold on, William. Just hold on." Arthur roared over the deafening sound of the torrential rain battering the windshield. In the rearview mirror, the elderly man was a terrifying sight. William was completely slumped against the door panel, his breath coming in shallow, ragged, agonizing gasps. His hands clawed desperately at the fabric of his heavy wool overcoat over his chest. He was losing the battle. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He slammed his foot down, pinning the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared, pushing the speedometer past 80 miles an hour on the treacherous, winding mountain descent. He didn't have time to pull over. He didn't have time to wait for a 911 dispatcher. He had to become the ambulance. Arthur's mind, trained by 30 years of diagnosing catastrophic mechanical failures under extreme pressure, snapped into absolute focus. He reached over and violently punched the hazard light button on his dashboard. With his other hand, he grabbed his cracked smartphone, bypassing the Uber app entirely, and hit the emergency dial for the city's central dispatch. "Dispatch, this is an emergency medical transport in progress," Arthur yelled into the speakerphone, his voice carrying the commanding, gravelly authority of a senior floor mechanic ordering his crew. "I am in a civilian vehicle, silver sedan, license plate Charlie 79er Delta. I have an elderly male passenger experiencing a massive, acute myocardial infarction. We are currently inbound on Interstate 4, approaching the downtown exit. I need a trauma team waiting at the emergency bay of Mercy General, and I need you to clear the intersections on 5th Avenue right now." "Sir, you need to pull over and wait for paramedics," the dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone, thick with bureaucratic protocol. "Civilian transport is highly discouraged. If I stop this car, this man dies." Arthur bellowed, his eyes locked on the blurry, neon-lit highway ahead. "Clear the damn road." He threw the phone onto the passenger seat and gripped the wheel with both hands. The city skyline loomed ahead, a chaotic maze of red brake lights and blinding street lamps. As Arthur merged onto the downtown exit ramp, the reality of the situation hit him. He was a rideshare driver carrying a dying man. If he crashed, if he caused an accident, he wouldn't just lose his job, he would go to prison. He was risking his own fragile, desperate life for a complete stranger. But as Arthur looked in the rearview mirror and saw the ashen, terrified face of the old man gasping for air, he didn't see a stranger. He saw Martha, lying in her hospital bed, terrified and alone. He saw himself, thrown out onto the street, discarded by a world that didn't care. He was not going to let this man die alone in the back of his car. Arthur hit the city streets like a missile. He laid on the horn, a continuous deafening blare that echoed off the towering glass skyscrapers. He wove violently through the sparse, late-night traffic, his tires hydroplaning over massive puddles. A red light loomed ahead at a major intersection. Arthur didn't even tap the brakes. He checked his blind spots with a rapid, predatory instinct and blew straight through the intersection at 70 miles an hour, narrowly avoiding a massive delivery truck that slammed on its brakes, its horn blaring in furious protest. "Stay with me, William," Arthur yelled, the sweat mixing with the dampness of his collar. "Don't you close your eyes on me." In the back seat, William's pale blue eyes fluttered, his head lolling dangerously. The agonizing pain in his chest was pulling him into the dark. 2 blocks away from Mercy General Hospital, a police cruiser sitting in a darkened parking lot suddenly flashed its lights. The blinding red and blue strobes pierced the rainy night, and the wail of the siren erupted directly behind Arthur's speeding sedan. Arthur didn't pull over. He pressed harder on the gas. He was not stopping. The illuminated red cross of the hospital emergency room finally pierced the darkness ahead. Arthur violently whipped the steering wheel, throwing the sedan directly into the ambulance bay. The car skidded across the wet concrete, stopping inches from the automatic sliding glass doors, tires smoking in the rain. The police cruiser skidded to a halt directly behind him, two officers jumping out with their hands resting aggressively on their holsters, fully prepared to draw on a fleeing suspect. Arthur didn't wait for them. He kicked his door open, ignoring the freezing rain, and sprinted to the back door of the sedan. He yanked it open, reaching into the back seat and grabbing the heavy, unconscious body of the elderly man. "We need help out here, now," Arthur roared, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the ambulance bay, completely ignoring the police officers rushing toward him. The sliding glass doors flew open. The dispatcher had listened. A highly trained trauma team, clad in blue scrubs and pushing a heavy gurney, flooded out into the rain. They immediately swarmed the car. "Acute MI, he's cyanotic, barely a pulse." A doctor yelled, expertly maneuvering William onto the gurney. "Get the crash cart ready in Bay 2. Let's move." Arthur stepped back, his chest heaving, his hands covered in engine oil and now trembling violently with adrenaline. He watched as the medical team rushed the elderly man through the glass doors, disappearing down a brightly lit, sterile hallway. A heavy hand suddenly clamped down on Arthur's shoulder, spinning him around. It was one of the police officers, his face tight with anger. "Are you out of your mind?" The officer yelled over the rain. "You ran 3 red lights and evaded a marked unit. I could arrest you right now for reckless endangerment." Arthur looked the officer dead in the eye. He didn't cower. He didn't apologize. He stood with the unyielding, iron-wrought posture of a man who had spent 30 years building the machines that powered the city. "I am an Uber driver," Arthur said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that instantly silenced the officer. "My passenger was dying. I brought him to the hospital. You want to arrest me for that? Go ahead and put the cuffs on me. But I am not leaving this waiting room until I know that old man is breathing." The officer stared at the exhausted, soaked mechanic. The anger in his eyes slowly faded, replaced by a grudging respect. He slowly removed his hand from Arthur's shoulder. "Get inside out of the rain," the officer muttered, turning and walking back to his cruiser. Arthur walked through the sliding glass doors into the sterile, quiet emergency room waiting area. The adrenaline crash hit him immediately, making his knees buckle slightly. He walked over to a cheap plastic chair in the corner and sat down. His clothes were soaked, his bones ached, and his phone was blowing up with furious notifications from the Uber app, warning him that his account had been temporarily suspended for erratic driving. He had lost his job. He had lost his pension. And now he had likely lost his only source of income. Arthur buried his calloused face in his hands. He was entirely ruined. But as he sat in the freezing waiting room, watching the clock tick past 4:00 a.m., he didn't leave. He didn't go home to sleep. He sat there for 6 agonizing hours, waiting for a doctor to tell him if the stranger he had risked everything to save had survived the night. He had absolutely no idea that the old man fighting for his life in Bay 2 was about to alter the entire trajectory of his universe. The harsh, sterile, fluorescent lights of the Mercy General waiting room buzzed with a low, monotonous hum. Morning sunlight began to creep through the rain-streaked glass doors, casting long, pale shadows across the cheap linoleum floor. Arthur Pendleton was still sitting in the exact same plastic chair in the corner. His damp canvas jacket had dried stiffly against his broad shoulders. He hadn't slept a wink. He had spent the last 6 hours staring blankly at the floor, mentally calculating how much time he had left before the bank foreclosed on his home, and how he was going to look Martha in the eye and tell her he couldn't afford her medicine. At 8:15 a.m., the heavy double doors leading to the intensive care unit pushed open. A weary-looking cardiologist in green scrubs stepped out, scanning the near-empty waiting area. Family for William. The doctor called out quietly. Arthur slowly stood up, his knees popping from the cold and exhaustion. I'm not his family, Doc. I'm just the driver who brought him in. Did he make it? The cardiologist let out a long, slow breath and offered a faint smile. It was a massive blockage in the left anterior descending artery. A widowmaker. If you had waited for an ambulance or if you had driven even 5 minutes slower, he would be in the morgue right now. But we got a stent in just in time. He is awake, he is stabilized, and incredibly, the first thing he asked for was the man who drove the car. Arthur let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. The crushing weight of his own ruined life was still there, but for a brief, fleeting moment he felt a profound sense of peace. He had done the right thing. Can I see him? Arthur asked, his gravelly voice thick with fatigue. Just for a few minutes, the doctor nodded, leading Arthur through the double doors and down the brightly lit ICU corridor. Arthur stepped into room 412. The rhythmic, steady beep of the heart monitor filled the quiet space. William was lying in the elevated hospital bed, an oxygen cannula resting under his nose and an IV line taped to his pale hand. He looked incredibly frail without his heavy wool overcoat, but as Arthur walked into the room, William's pale blue eyes opened. They were sharp, lucid, and completely alive. "You stayed," William whispered, his voice raspy but carrying an undeniable weight of gratitude. "The nurses told me you sat in the waiting room all night, in wet clothes." Arthur offered a tired, genuine smile, taking off his worn baseball cap and holding it in his calloused hands. "I don't leave a job half-finished, William. Just wanted to make sure the engine was still running before I clocked out." William let out a soft, weak chuckle that quickly turned into a cough. He reached out a trembling hand. Arthur stepped forward and took it gently. The old man's grip was surprisingly firm. "You saved my life, Arthur," William said, looking deeply into the mechanic's exhausted eyes. "I am a man who believes that every debt in this universe must be paid, and I owe you the ultimate debt. Tell me what I can do for you. Name your price." Arthur shook his head, gently pulling his hand back. "You don't owe me a dime, sir. I didn't drive through those red lights for a payout. I did it because it was the right thing to do. You just focus on resting." Arthur turned to leave, fully prepared to walk out into the cold morning and face his own impending ruin. "Wait," William called out, his voice suddenly gaining strength. "In the car, before my chest seized. You told me you were a master mechanic for 30 years. You told me you were fired just 5 days before your pension vested because of a spreadsheet." Arthur stopped at the door, his broad shoulders tensing. The bitter reality of his situation flooded back into his mind, choking him. Why is a master mechanic, a man who knows how to calibrate heavy industry, driving a cab at 2 in the morning? William demanded, his pale blue eyes narrowing with intense, calculating focus. "Who did this to you, Arthur? What company?" Arthur sighed, turning back around. He was too tired to hide the truth anymore. He was too broken to keep his pride intact. "Vanguard Heavy Industries," Arthur said, the name leaving a taste like battery acid in his mouth. The heart monitor next to William's bed instantly spiked. The steady beep-beep suddenly accelerated. William's entire demeanor shifted. The frail, elderly patient vanished. Suddenly, the man lying in the hospital bed radiated an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. His jaw tightened and the color seemed to rush back into his pale face. "Vanguard," William repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerously low octave. "And who explicitly signed your termination papers?" "The new CEO. A kid named Julian Vance," Arthur replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "Look, it doesn't matter anymore. He said it was a corporate restructuring, liquidating legacy liabilities to optimize the third quarter cash flow. My wife has cancer, William. The pension carried her medical insurance. Julian knew that. But he looked me dead in the eye and told me my 30 years of loyalty was just a red line on his budget. He threw me out with a cardboard box so he could secure his year-end bonus." Arthur looked down at his oil-stained, calloused hands. "I gave that company my blood. I built those machines, and they threw me away like garbage. Silence fell over the hospital room. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a massive detonation. When Arthur finally looked up, he saw something terrifying in William's eyes. It was not pity. It was pure, unadulterated, apocalyptic rage. William reached over with his free hand and ripped the oxygen cannula from his nose. He pressed the red call button attached to the bed railing with violent force. "Sir, you need to calm down," Arthur said, stepping forward, alarmed by the sudden spike in the heart monitor. "Your heart." "My heart is perfectly fine, Arthur," William interrupted, his voice echoing off the sterile walls with the booming resonance of a titan of industry. "But my company is apparently infected with a parasite." Arthur froze. Your company." A young nurse rushed into the room, looking panicked by the alarm. "Mr. Vance, what's wrong? Are you in pain?" "I need my personal mobile phone from my belongings right now," William commanded, entirely ignoring her question. His tone brokered absolutely no argument. The nurse, intimidated by his sheer authority, quickly retrieved a sleek satellite phone from his bagged personal items and handed it to him. William looked back at the bewildered mechanic standing at the foot of his bed. "My full name is William Vanguard," the elderly man stated, his pale blue eyes burning with an incredibly cold fire. 40 years ago, I built Vanguard Heavy Industries from a single, rusted-out garage in Queens. I built it on the principle that the men who turn the wrenches are the blood and bone of the empire. I retired 5 years ago and handed the operational reins to a board of directors. I trusted them to maintain the soul of my company. William gripped the phone, his knuckles turning white. "Julian Vance is a hired mercenary," William hissed, absolute disgust dripping from every syllable. "A sociopath in a tailored suit who thinks he can dismantle my life's work and destroy my men for a quarterly bonus. He thinks he is untouchable because he hides behind legal loopholes." William dialed a highly encrypted number. It rang exactly once. "Elias," William barked into the phone, his voice carrying the lethal precision of a military general. "I don't care what time it is. Mobilize the senior legal team, ground the corporate jet, and pull the architectural blueprints for the executive boardroom at Vanguard Tower. I am initiating an alpha-level ethics override." William lowered the phone and looked directly into Arthur's exhausted, tear-filled eyes. The billionaire's expression softened into one of profound brotherhood. "You gave me my life tonight, Arthur," William said quietly, a terrifying promise lingering in the air. "Now I am going to give you back yours. We are going to a board meeting." 48 hours later, the atmosphere inside the sprawling, glass-walled executive boardroom at the apex of Vanguard Tower was electric with the intoxicating thrill of corporate greed. Sitting around the massive, polished mahogany table were the 12 members of the Vanguard Heavy Industries Board of Directors. At the head of the table stood Julian Vance. He was in his absolute element. Wearing a bespoke, navy blue Brioni suit and a self-satisfied smirk, Julian tapped a laser pointer against a glowing digital presentation projected onto the far wall. The chart on the screen displayed a jagged green line skyrocketing upward, breaking past projected profit margins and soaring into record-breaking financial territory. "Gentlemen and ladies," Julian announced, his voice smooth, confident, and dripping with arrogance. "What you are looking at is not just a successful quarter. It is a paradigm shift. We have successfully executed Phase 2 of our internal restructuring, resulting in a 22% reduction in operational overhead." A murmur of approval rippled across the table. "How exactly did we achieve such a drastic reduction in the third quarter, Julian?" asked Richard, a senior board member, peering over his reading glasses. "Material costs haven't dropped." "Material costs are static, Richard. The true drain on this corporation has always been human capital," Julian replied smoothly, clicking to the next slide. The screen filled with a complex algorithm of employee ID numbers and termination dates. I initiated a targeted, algorithm-driven legacy purge across the manufacturing floors, Julian explained, completely devoid of a single ounce of human empathy. We identified 68 senior-level mechanics and floor managers who were within a 4-week window of vesting into their Tier 1 legacy pension plans. These were men who were about to lock the company into lifetime health care and massive retirement payouts. Julian smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth. By systematically terminating their contracts exactly 5 to 10 days before maturation, we legally voided the pension obligations. We replaced them with entry-level contractors at a fraction of the base salary. In one sweeping move, I saved this corporation over $14 million in projected liabilities over the next decade, and it is completely, undeniably legal. A few of the younger board members actually clapped. Julian basked in the applause, already calculating the massive, multi-million-dollar executive bonus he was going to demand at the end of the meeting. He felt entirely untouchable. He had outsmarted the system, and he had done it by crushing the lives of men he had never even bothered to look in the eye. A brilliant maneuver, Julian, Richard nodded, though a faint hint of discomfort crossed his face. But what about the blowback, union grievances, lawsuits? Let them sue, Julian scoffed dismissively, tossing his laser pointer onto the mahogany table. They are broken, uneducated blue-collar workers. They don't have the capital to fight our legal department. They will take their 2 weeks of severance and they will disappear. We have completely optimized the machine. The era of corporate charity at Vanguard is over. Julian leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table to deliver his closing statement. I am the future of this company, and under my leadership, we will never look backward. The heavy, frosted glass double doors of the executive boardroom did not just open. They were violently shoved apart. The heavy crack of the doors hitting the doorstops echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. Julian's head snapped up, his arrogant smile instantly vanishing, replaced by a flash of indignant rage. Excuse me, who authorized you to open those doors? We are in the middle of a closed-door executive session. Security. A team of 4 men stepped into the boardroom, but they were not Vanguard building security. They wore immaculate, matching dark suits, discreet earpieces, and carried an aura of terrifying, lethal professionalism. They immediately fanned out, securing the perimeter of the room and physically blocking the exits. Following closely behind them was Elias, a high-level corporate fixer, carrying a thick, black leather briefcase. What is the meaning of this? Julian shouted, his face flushing crimson. He looked at the board members, expecting them to share his outrage. Instead, the board members were staring at the doorway with expressions of sheer, unadulterated shock. Richard, the senior board member, actually dropped his expensive pen. His face turned completely white. Stepping through the glass doors was a man leaning heavily on a polished ebony cane. William Vanguard wore a classic, tailored charcoal suit. He moved slowly, the physical toll of a massive heart attack still evident in his careful steps. But there was absolutely nothing weak about the man. The air in the boardroom seemed to freeze solid the moment he crossed the threshold. His pale blue eyes swept across the room, carrying the crushing, undeniable weight of a true titan of industry. He did not look like a retired old man. He looked like a god of war returning to a desecrated temple, and walking exactly 1 pace behind his right shoulder, no longer wearing grease-stained coveralls but dressed in a clean, sharp, modest suit, was Arthur Pendleton. The master mechanic stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his calloused hands resting calmly at his sides. He looked directly at Julian Vance. Julian's brain short-circuited. He recognized the founder from oil paintings in the lobby, but he couldn't comprehend reality. William Vanguard had been retired for 5 years, living in total seclusion. He wasn't supposed to be here, and the man standing next to him. Julian squinted, a sudden, sickening jolt of recognition hitting his stomach. It was the mechanic, the one with the sick wife, the one he had thrown out like garbage 2 weeks ago. William. Richard stammered, frantically pushing his chair back and standing up in a display of deep instinctual respect. "Mr. Vanguard, we didn't know you were coming to the city. If we had known." "Sit down, Richard." William's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone in the room. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. Richard immediately dropped back into his leather chair, swallowing hard. Julian desperately tried to regain control of his hijacked meeting. He puffed out his chest, stepping away from the projector screen. "Mr. Vanguard," Julian said, forcing a tight, patronizing smile. "It is an honor to finally meet you in person. However, as the chief executive officer of this corporation, I must insist on proper protocol. You stepped down from the operational board 5 years ago. You hold a majority share, yes, but you cannot simply storm into a closed quarterly strategy meeting with a terminated line worker." William stopped at the opposite end of the mahogany table. He rested both hands on the silver handle of his ebony cane. He looked at Julian not as a CEO, but as a disgusting, pathetic insect that had crawled onto his pristine floor. "You," William whispered, the cold fury in his tone slicing through the room like a razor blade, "are standing in a building that bears my name. You are breathing air that I paid to condition, and you have the absolute audacity to lecture me on protocol." Julian's patronizing smile faltered. A bead of cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. "Mr. Vanguard, I was simply trying to explain. You have spent the last 20 minutes bragging about how you optimized my company," William interrupted, his pale blue eyes burning a hole straight through Julian's skull. "You bragged about a brilliant algorithm that identifies the most loyal, dedicated men in this corporation and fires them exactly 5 days before they can secure the retirement they bled to earn." William raised a trembling finger, pointing directly at the glowing digital chart on the wall. "You call it strategic legacy termination," William said, his voice rising, the suppressed rage finally beginning to detonate. "I call it the cowardly, sociopathic theft of human dignity. You did not optimize my company, Mr. Vance. You infected it." Julian looked around the table, desperately seeking allies, but the board members were entirely silent, their eyes averted, terrified of the wrath of the founder. Julian was completely alone. The trap had been sprung, and the jaws were about to snap shut. "I operated strictly within the legal parameters of my contract." Julian fired back, his voice pitching higher as the terrifying reality of his situation began to set in. He pointed a manicured, trembling finger at Arthur. "My fiduciary duty is to maximize the profit margins for the shareholders, not to run a charity ward for obsolete line workers. He is a mechanic, Mr. Vanguard. He is a replaceable gear in a machine. If you let sentimentality dictate corporate policy, Vanguard Heavy Industries will bleed capital." Julian looked frantically at the board members. Tell him the numbers. The board approved my restructuring proposal." Richard, the senior board member, shrank back into his leather chair, violently shaking his head, entirely abandoning the young CEO. William Vanguard did not yell. He took one slow, deliberate step forward, leaning his weight onto his ebony cane. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. "A replaceable gear," William repeated, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. He turned his head slightly, looking at Arthur. "Arthur Pendleton, 29 years and 360 days. You threw him onto the street with a cardboard box, stripping him of his wife's cancer insurance to save a fraction of a decimal point on your quarterly report. Do you know what this replaceable gear did to survive, Mr. Vance?" Julian swallowed hard, his throat entirely dry. He couldn't speak. "He drove a cab," William stated, his voice echoing with devastating clarity. "At 62 years old, after giving his body to my factory floor for 3 decades, he drove an Uber at 2 in the morning in a torrential storm just to afford anti-nausea medication for his dying wife." William turned his piercing blue eyes back to the board of directors. "And when a passenger had a massive, fatal heart attack in the back of his car, this obsolete line worker did not wait for an ambulance. He risked his own life, his own freedom, and ran 3 red lights to physically carry that passenger into an emergency room. William struck the floor with the heavy silver tip of his cane, the sound cracking like a whip. That passenger was me. A collective, horrified gasp erupted from the boardroom table. Richard covered his mouth in absolute shock. The board members stared at Arthur, realizing with sickening clarity that the mechanic they had allowed Julian to fire had literally just saved the life of the company's founder. Julian's face turned an ashen, sickly gray. His perfect posture collapsed. The absolute cosmic irony of the situation crushed the air right out of his lungs. "You did not optimize Vanguard Heavy Industries, Julian," William said, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. "You hollowed it out. You stripped away its soul. A company built on the blood and sweat of working men cannot survive when it is led by a parasite." William slowly turned his head toward the corporate fixer standing by the door. "Elias, execute the alpha-level ethics override." Elias stepped forward, resting his thick black leather briefcase on the polished mahogany table. He snapped the gold locks open and pulled out a stack of pristine, red-stamped legal documents. He did not hand them to Julian. He began distributing them to the board members. When Mr. Vanguard stepped down from daily operations 5 years ago, he retained an absolute, irrevocable veto power over executive management, Elias stated smoothly, adjusting his glasses. Specifically, an ethics clause regarding gross moral turpitude and malicious financial practices. Elias pulled a final document from the briefcase and slid it across the table. It stopped precisely in front of Julian Vance. "Julian Vance," Elias declared, his voice devoid of any warmth. "As of 9:00 a.m. this morning, you are officially terminated as Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Heavy Industries, effective immediately." Julian stared at the termination paper, his hands shaking violently. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked greed. "Fine," Julian hissed, his voice trembling with humiliated rage. "You want to fire me over a mechanic? Fine. I will have my lawyers draft the separation agreement. My contract guarantees a $12 million severance package, plus the immediate vesting of all my stock options. I will take my golden parachute, and I will go to a company that actually understands modern capitalism." Julian reached out to grab the paper, fully intending to walk out of the room a multimillionaire. Before his fingers could even brush the document, the heavy silver tip of William's ebony cane slammed down onto the mahogany table, pinning the paper completely flat. William leaned across the table, his face mere inches from Julian's terrified, sweating forehead. "You are not listening to me, boy," William whispered, the cold, absolute authority in his voice freezing the blood in Julian's veins. "There is no golden parachute. There is no severance package." Julian's eyes widened in sheer panic. You can't do that. It's in my contract. I will sue you for every penny." "Read Clause 7, Section 4 of the document Elias just handed you," William commanded softly. Julian frantically scanned the legal jargon, his eyes darting back and forth. His breath hitched violently. "Under the alpha-level ethics override, an executive terminated for gross moral turpitude completely forfeits all unvested stock options, quarterly bonuses, and severance capital," Elias explained, delivering the killing blow with surgical precision. "You are entitled to absolutely nothing." Julian staggered backward, his knees buckling slightly. $0. The $12 million payout, the record-breaking bonuses he had bragged about just 5 minutes ago, all of it vanished into thin air. He had spent the last 2 weeks firing men to line his own pockets, and now his own pockets had been completely emptied by a single signature. He was utterly financially annihilated. "Furthermore," William announced, standing tall, his voice projecting across the silent boardroom, "the $14 million you attempted to steal from the retirement fund is being immediately frozen. Elias, I want an emergency directive issued to human resources within the hour." Elias nodded, his pen hovering over a legal pad. "Instructing them to do what, Mr. Vanguard?" William looked directly at the glowing spreadsheet of terminated employees on the wall, and then he looked at the stoic, exhausted face of Arthur Pendleton. "Contact all 68 mechanics and line workers that Julian Vance terminated," William ordered, his voice echoing with the undeniable power of absolute justice. "Reinstate all of them, fully restore their legacy pensions, reinstate their medical insurance, and issue every single one of them a check for 2 years of back pay, directly funded by the liquidation of Mr. Vance's frozen executive compensation." Julian let out a pathetic, suffocating gasp. His wealth was being literally handed over to the blue-collar workers he despised. He had lost his job, his reputation, and his fortune in less than 5 minutes. William Vanguard turned his back on the broken CEO, completely dismissing him from his reality. He looked at the security team blocking the doors. "Security," William said quietly, pointing his cane toward the door. "Mr. Vance is now trespassing. Escort him off my property. Do not let him pack his office. Give him a cardboard box." The 2 corporate security operatives, towering, broad-shouldered men who had absolutely zero sympathy for fallen executives, stepped forward in perfect unison. One of them reached into his jacket, pulled out a flat, unconstructed cardboard box, and casually tossed it onto the polished mahogany table. It slid and stopped precisely in front of Julian Vance. It was the exact same type of cheap, flimsy box Julian had ordered his guards to give Arthur 2 weeks ago. "Let's go, Mr. Vance," the lead security guard rumbled, placing a heavy, unyielding hand on Julian's bespoke, navy blue shoulder. Julian was entirely paralyzed. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The absolute reality of his total destruction had short-circuited his arrogant brain. He looked at the board members, the men and women he had manipulated and charmed just an hour earlier. Not a single one of them met his gaze. Richard, the senior board member, was intensely pretending to study a blank notepad. With a humiliating, pathetic whimper, Julian picked up the cardboard box. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold it. The security guards did not escort him to the private executive elevator. In a move of calculated, poetic justice, William had specifically ordered them to march Julian down through the main manufacturing floor. As the heavy metal doors of the freight elevator opened onto the roaring, massive expanse of the factory, Julian stepped out into his worst nightmare. The deafening sound of the hydraulic presses and massive turbines suddenly began to power down. The word had already spread. Hundreds of mechanics, welders, and line workers, the very people Julian had viewed as obsolete, replaceable gears, stopped what they were doing. They stood by their machines, their faces covered in grease and soot, and watched in absolute, deafening silence as the 32-year-old WizKid CEO was marched toward the exit, carrying a cheap cardboard box. There was no yelling. There was no cheering. The absolute silence of the working class was a far more terrifying condemnation than any insult could ever be. Julian kept his eyes glued to the concrete floor, tears of ultimate humiliation streaming down his face. The automated glass doors of the lobby slid open, and he was thrust out into the cold, gray morning, permanently locked out of the empire he had tried to steal. Back up in the executive boardroom, the heavy, suffocating tension had finally dissipated. William Vanguard waved his hand dismissively. "Leave us," he commanded the board of directors. Richard and the others practically scrambled out of their leather chairs, terrified to be in the founder's crosshairs for a second longer than necessary. They hurried out the glass doors, leaving only William, his corporate fixer Elias, and Arthur Pendleton alone in the sprawling, quiet room. William let out a long, heavy sigh. The terrifying aura of the corporate titan slowly melted away, leaving behind the exhausted but deeply grateful elderly man from the hospital. He leaned heavily on his ebony cane and walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the sprawling industrial complex he had built from nothing. "I apologize, Arthur," William said softly, his back turned to the room. I built this machine to provide a livelihood for thousands of families. I stepped away thinking it could run itself. I was a fool. I allowed sociopaths with spreadsheets to hijack the soul of my company. I allowed them to hurt you. Arthur stood near the table, still entirely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what had just occurred. Mr. Vanguard, I don't know what to say. You just gave me my life back. William turned around, a gentle, paternal smile warming his pale blue eyes. I haven't even started yet, my friend, William replied. He gestured to Elias, who pulled another document from his leather briefcase. Arthur, Elias began, his professional tone softening significantly. Your Tier 1 legacy pension has been fully reinstated and backdated. You have officially crossed the 30-year threshold as of this morning. Furthermore, your wife's medical insurance has been upgraded to a platinum executive policy, completely free of premium charges. Arthur's breath hitched. The suffocating, terrifying weight that had been crushing his chest for 2 weeks instantly evaporated. And regarding Martha, William interjected gently. Elias has already contacted the chief of oncology at Johns Hopkins. We are flying a specialized medical transport team to your local hospital this afternoon. Martha is being transferred to the best cancer facility in the country, and Vanguard Heavy Industries is covering every single cent of her treatment, out of pocket. She is going to get the best care on earth, Arthur. Arthur Pendleton, the hardened, broad-shouldered master mechanic who had survived 30 years of grueling, bone-breaking labor without ever shedding a tear, finally broke. He dropped his face into his heavily calloused hands, his shoulders shaking as a lifetime of stress, fear, and profound gratitude poured out of him in heavy, silent sobs. William did not interrupt him. He simply stood there leaning on his cane, allowing the veteran mechanic to finally let go of his burden. After a long moment, Arthur wiped his face with the sleeve of his suit jacket, looking up at the billionaire with eyes full of unwavering loyalty. Thank you. God bless you, William. I will go back down to the floor right now. I'll get the Mark IV presses calibrated. I owe you my life. You are not going back down to the manufacturing floor, Arthur, William said firmly, walking over to the massive mahogany table and pulling out the leather chair at the very head of the boardroom. The chair Julian Vance had occupied just 10 minutes ago. Arthur looked confused. But you said I was reinstated. You are, William smiled, gesturing for Arthur to sit. But you are no longer a senior floor mechanic. William rested his hands on the back of the chair, looking at Arthur with absolute respect. I realize today that a company cannot survive if the people making the decisions at the top have never bled on the floor at the bottom. We need a conscience in this room. We need someone who knows what it means to be a replaceable gear, and who will fight to make sure no one is ever treated like one again. William reached out and placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Arthur's shoulder. As of today, Arthur Pendleton, I am appointing you to the board of directors as the Supreme Director of Employee Welfare and Ethics. You have absolute veto power over any termination protocol and a direct line to me. You will never hold a wrench again, my friend. You are going to help me run my company. Arthur stared at the massive mahogany table and then out the window at the sprawling city. He had woken up that morning as a ruined, desperate Uber driver facing homelessness. He was ending the day as one of the most powerful corporate executives in the city, with his wife's life saved and his legacy forever cemented. We live in an era where human beings are frequently reduced to data points, where algorithms dictate our worth, and where the blind pursuit of profit often strips away our fundamental humanity. The story of Arthur Pendleton and Julian Vance is a stark, powerful reminder that loyalty is not a line item on a spreadsheet to be manipulated. It is a sacred bond. When arrogance and greed blind the powerful, they will inevitably fall to the very hands they sought to crush. Never forget the profound value of the people who turn the gears of society, for true power is not measured by how much you can extract from others, but by how fiercely you protect those who have bled for your success. Thank you for listening.